right, I'd like to welcome everyone today to PASS this final summer camp digital mapping in 911 that we're going to do this summer. Really appreciate you all taking your time out of your day to listen to us kind of talk a little bit about some technology, some things that are happening in the educational industry, and ways that we can make sure that as we're providing safe and secure schools, how we can implement the technology in an effective manner. So, Scott Lord, I'll be the host today, and I want to introduce my esteemed presenters. I'm going to start with Lori Anderson. Lori is the Senior Advisor of Emergency Communications and Response with TSG Advisors Public Safety and a nationally recognized leader with more than 30 years of experience in 911 operations, NG 911 training, and emergency communications. A former president of the National Emergency Number Association and past Florida State E911 board member. She has helped shape 911 policy, technology, workforce initiatives at the local, state, and national levels. Lori is passionate about advancing emergency communications through collaboration, mentoring, and strategic planning that strengthens agencies and supports the public safety professionals who serve their communities. So, Lori, welcome. Next, we
Thank
have
you.
Dan. Dan is currently the Director of Government Affairs for GEOCOM. In his role, he is responsible for tracking, managing, and leading policy and legislative initiatives related to the school safety and public safety industries. Prior to GEOCOM, Dan was the 911 Program Manager, Deputy Director of the Emergency Communication Networks Division at the Minnesota Department of Public Safety, which houses the State 911 program, Armor radio system, IPAWS program, and FirstNet. Dan led several projects including 911 network security, NG 911 GIS project, and mission critical data interoperability. So Dan, thank you for joining us today. And then last but certainly not least, Sylvia Ayefta is the co-founder and executive director of the National Institute for School Safety Policy, bringing more than 18 years of experience in school safety, public safety, emergency management, and policy implementation. She previously served in senior leadership roles with the Florida Department of Education Office of Safe Schools and as Vice President of Public Policy and Government Affairs at Centegic. Her work focuses on advancing practical, evidence-informed measures that strengthen school safety, preparedness, and emergency response. So, welcome, Sylvia. And I am Scott Lord with Electronic Contracting Company. I'm an integrator, been in the business about since 1999. I'm also a founding member and co-chair of the technical committee for the Partner Alliance for Safer Schools, and have been working on school safety. I can say the turn of the century, so that's kind of wild to say at this time in our lives. But so I'll be moderating today as we listening to these wonderful experts bring us some of the information that we have. So the first thing that I want to begin with is we're going to kind of start a little bit with who is PASS and what that means to us and kind of what we are if you do not know who PASS is. Then we're going to get into Alyssa's law that really kind of focuses around the panic alarm technology that we're seeing out there in digital mapping and how those are two coming together for our emergency response and how we do response to emergencies that are happening. Then we're going to go through some ideas on panic alarm processes, on how we can actually bring these technologies into a holistic and effective and efficient approach. And probably the most thing that we'll talk about today is training. When we're adapting and working with these new technologies and we have so many different stakeholders that are involved, sometimes it's difficult to make sure that this all fits correctly. So hopefully we will be able to give you some ideas on how to do those implementations. So with that, I'm going to kick us off. For those of you who do not know, Partner Alliance for Safer Schools was established in 2014. It was a group of about 8 individuals came together from really across the country and different organizations like the chief of, or the National Association of Chief of Police and some IT directors and security professionals and consultants and manufacturers all coming together to basically answer one question. How do we put security technology into schools? And as someone whose background is in life safety and a large part of that being in fire alarm, we have codes that actually establish that. There aren't really any codes or any ways or recommendations on how to look at security as a strategic approach, and specifically to schools. One of the things that we say at PASS is if you've seen one school, you've seen one school. Each one of them is slightly different in the building. Each one of them is slightly different on how their culture. Each one is slightly different on how they respond to different emergencies. So, looking at that, the team came together and created the Partner Alliance for Safer Schools, really to try to take all of that technology that's out there, all of those ways that we can keep the schools safe in the physical perspective, and bring that together in something that's easy to use for our security or for our educational customers, for the educational market, for the educators. So that's what PASS has been doing now for over 10 years. And really, this is probably what explains PASS in a nutshell. Is, this person in the middle is the newly elected superintendent or security director who said, go forth and make this all happen. And as you can see here, when we look at that, there's just so many different things, especially in schools, that is so unique on what it is that we're looking for and what you have to deal with in that. A large part of that is how we assemble that team. There are so many different stakeholders inside the community, like our parents, our emergency responders, our students, the media, all of these being different places that are having that are working towards trying to help, or they need to be able to respond. So we also have IT is now in the mix because all of these systems run off of the IT network. The next thing would be, our administrative staff. We've got to talk with the Board of Education. We've got to look at budgets. We've got to look at staffing, as well as who's going to actually help us support this equipment. And then we move on into navigating all those different systems. And we start talking about how we're going to get emergency alarms to our first responders and how does that work? How does that tie into our communication systems in the building itself? How do we use things such as digital mapping to help provide that one layer of glass? But in doing so, we're also bringing multiple technologies, multiple things together in a way that we want it to be cohesive and easy to be able to use. And with that, we can end up having a large amount of decisions and processes that we really have to kind of put together. And then at the end of it, we actually have to go ahead and put that process, that plan into practice with training, with having the appropriate ways that we're going to develop that culture of safety. So as you can see, one of the things that PASS has tried to do is give that roadmap for that person on how we're actually going to take care of these challenges. So moving forward, I'm going to start off with Sylvia. Sylvia, would you kind of give us the evolution of the panic alerts? This really kind of started with Alyssa's Law. So if you could kind of go through and just educate us on how this all came about, where it's going, and what some of the next steps are that our educators can use in helping create a safe school.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So, first of all, I want to start with a quick background on what Alyssa's Law is, if there's anyone that's not familiar with it. So, Alyssa's Law is named after Alyssa Al-Hadaf, who was one of the 17 fatal victims at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School on February 14th, 2018. The law is championed by Alyssa's mother, Lori Aladef, who created the nonprofit Make Our Schools Safe after the tragic loss of her daughter. So Lori travels around the country talking to lawmakers and stakeholders about the legislation. After the shooting at MSD, the Florida legislature also created the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School Public Safety Commission. So this commission was tasked with investigating the system failures around the shooting, examining other incidents of mass violence, and recommending improvements. So subsequently, the commission's findings informed all of the school safety legislation in Florida. So we've passed school safety legislation every year since 2018. It's also influenced legislation in other states, especially and including Alyssa's Law. So what you see on your screen here is a timeline of how Alyssa's Law has iterated over the past 7 years across the U.S. Also included here are some other major tragic school incidents that further influence the legislation as it has evolved over time. So you're welcome to take screenshots of this information, but I believe Scott's also going to drop the links of the enacted legislation for each state into the chat in case you want to take a deeper dive. So, one of the things that you may notice right off the bat next to each state is that you may see required, must be considered, permissive, or flexible. So, basically, what this means is that depending on the state, school districts may be required to implement a panic alarm, or you may also hear it called a duress system. So, if they have that requirement, this usually has specific funding attached to it. It may be recurring, it may be one time, it may be a grant. Or the school districts may be required to consider it as part of their school safety planning, or they may be permitted to use school safety funding for implementation of a panic alert system. So each state has a little bit different approach, but what this does is it allows the districts and the states to evaluate their needs. So thinking back to your past guidelines, making sure that you're putting your basic needs in place first and then tapping into that fund appropriately. So just taking a look at the why behind the what. So the original policy question for Alyssa's Law was fairly simple. How do we get information of a potential crisis situation on campus to the right responders as quickly as possible? The ultimate goal being to reduce the time and the friction involved with getting emergency information to the appropriate 911, to law enforcement, other responders, and just as importantly, to building occupants. And then also, we want to make sure that each staff member, no matter where they are on campus, has that capability to send a notification that either they need help or that there is a potential campus emergency that everyone needs to react to. So this goes back to the MSD Commission's findings, where they cited issues involving the 911 call routing, radio interoperability, confusion among responding agencies, as well as emergency notification inside of Building 12 where the shooting occurred. So I want to just kind of run through these real quick, take a high level view at where the legislation started and how it evolved. So, starting with New Jersey. So, New Jersey is the Alladef's home state before they moved to Parkland, Florida. So, in New Jersey, it was actually the first state to enact Alyssa's Law, and it simply required a non audible alarm in each public school building that connected directly with law enforcement. And that's it, that's all it was. So in 2019, Florida was also considering its own version of Alyssa's Law, which passed in 2020. Florida's version required that the system be a mobile solution and that it both be integrated with the public safety answering point infrastructure as well as that direct connection with law enforcement. And then you'll also see a note here on your screen that Florida's Alyssa's Law was additionally expanded in 2025 to strengthen the capabilities on the PSAP integration side. So then you also have New York's version in 2022. This is where you see the addition of the internal communication component. And then, as we remember, 2022 is also the same year as the tragedy at Robb Elementary School, which further informed Texas legislation. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see that the Texas law specifically specifies that the capability exists within every classroom. So this shifts that concept from does every school have a panic alert system to does the closest person to an emergency have access to it. This specific iteration also helps improve emergency location information that is going to the responders so that we can drill down to where on campus that alert originated and whether the threat is moving. Then you go on to Oklahoma's legislation, and they add that requirement for the location information as well. And then we start seeing this requirement for incorporating floor plans into the alerting system, as well as those automated notification systems to school personnel. So I mentioned Florida's legislation expanded in 2025. This expansion also had that integration of the digital school maps as a component of it. In Georgia, you're starting to see some inclusion of similar legislation in their 2025 law after the shooting at Appalachie High School in Barrow County. That occurred in September of 2024. And then you're also starting to see this expansion of the definition of in-building notifications, meaning that they need to be multisensory in nature, very similar to requirements around fire alarms, though not as expansive, but we just want to make sure that there's both an audio and a visual emergency notification to building occupants. So basically, to summarize, we've seen basically three shifts in the legislation has evolved. First, going from those fixed building level alarms to mobile safety devices that a school staff member can have on them or assigned to them. Second is ensuring that there's integration with other safety infrastructure on campus, including those digital mapping systems. So again, going back to the past guidelines, that we often refer to the unification of systems as a leading practice. So this is where you start to see that popping up in legislation. And third, and really just as vital, is requiring that immediate indoor audio-visual notification of emergency to those building occupants. Again, the whole purpose of Alyssa's law is to provide better emergency notification to building occupants and better location information to responders. What we really need to make sure that we're all continually working on is providing the best information possible to the people that need it. So that's the bottom line. They need to better understand where an emergency is happening and also what they may encounter on the way to responding to that emergency. So, as we transition specifically to discussing digital maps, something else I want to leave everybody with that we all need to remind ourselves that work in school safety is these maps not only need to meet the requirements of both the responders and the PSAPs, but these maps also need to meet the needs of the schools. These maps need to be maintained, validated. We need to make sure that we're using them in drills and exercises, and that they're integrated with the emergency plans and other security systems in the school. And so I'm going to stop right there and hand it back over to you, Scott.
All right. Thanks, Sylvia. I appreciate it. And I think it's a great segue, and we're going to kind of move over to Dan to talk a little bit about the digital mapping because, when we talk about Alyssa's law and how that all started and the progression that we've had, we started seeing other technologies being introduced into the school safety realm to be able to meet some of the requirements that you were just talking about, Sylvia, specifically of where are they on a map? If we're going to have this device activated. So Dan, would you want to go ahead and just kind of take us through kind of what that means? What does a digital map look like today? How is that being used, as well as some of the evolution you're seeing as well on how this is kind of being legislated to our schools and what we can expect?
Yes, Scott, thank you. And Sylvia, appreciate the transition there and kind of setting me up. So I just want to kind of start a little bit on what a digital map is. I think we all have maybe an idea. There is a pretty wide spectrum of what a map can be. We use them in our daily lives on a pretty regular basis, right? We're driving somewhere. But a digital map for a school, as Sylvia shared, is really intended to provide awareness. And so I want to start here with what a number of first responders see when there's an event at a school or, frankly, any other building. But obviously, schools are the focus of our conversation today. Uh, the location of a 911 call today can be very accurate. I'm not saying it's always accurate, but the FCC has worked with vendors and other policymakers to ensure that the location and accuracy of the 911 call or any other alert, whether it be from Alyssa's law or a notification coming from the school, is accurate. And that's a great first step. But if you think about what first responders are seeing, if that call is accurate, really, where is this emergency happening within the building? Now, maybe if the 911 telecommunicator or an SRO is familiar with their building, they're going to be able to know where this is. That's not always the case. But this is a starting point, and frankly, this isn't bad historically. The fact that we even have digital maps to begin with is an upgrade from how many emergencies have been handled over the last few decades. But we can do better. And the legislation that Sylvia referenced and some of the advancements in technology, again, we can do better. So a digital map is really a digital representation of an indoor space. So I'm going to kind of go over to another view here. We mocked this up internally thanks to our Becca Reith here at Geocom that did this for us. We wanted something a bit more vendor agnostic, right? We didn't want to just show all of our technology. But here's a top-down overview of a school. And again, if an emergency came in, really, where is it happening? But again, a digital map, and I'm going to use this slider, and hopefully there's not too much of a delay, can
Hey,
provide.
Dan.
Yep.
Real quick, you need
Yep.
to share your screen.
Oh, it's not sharing?
No, sir. Not that I'm
It,
seeing.
it
I
is
can see it
sharing,
on my
Aaron.
end.
Yep.
Okay, cool.
Oh, well, there we go. Um, so when I move that slider over, really what I'm trying to highlight is the increased context and situational awareness that can be available to school officials and first responders during times of crisis. Right. So the goal of this data is to ensure that it's up to date and it's accurate. It has information that is helpful for response. So I'm thinking of door numbers. If there's an emergency in the gym, you don't want to necessarily come in through the cafetorium, which is a whole new term that I didn't necessarily know about until recently, that the auditorium and the cafeteria came together. Uh, but right, there are better ways to get into a space depending on where the location is. And having that data within a map that is available again to school officials and first responders to better respond to an emergency is the goal of this data. So again, you can have certain information on here, the location of AEDs, fire extinguishers, utility cutoffs, cameras, links to camera feeds, all of that information depending on the use case and the vendor is absolutely possible. And so how are you going to view this data? Now, ideally, you're going to use systems that you're already using, right? I don't think any of us necessarily need another login, another screen, another platform. So I think in the best case scenario, this data is integrated into the platforms that you're already using, whether it's your alerting platform at the school, or if you're at the PSAP, it's within your CAD or mapping application. So that's the ideal scenario where this data lives and then it's accessible. And then again, going back to what Sylvia said, when you have that alert occurring within a school, if you can visually portray where that's happening, you can decrease response time and save lives. That's the goal of what all of us are trying to do. And that's where this map provides value. So, Scott, I'm going to stop sharing here and we can go back to the slide about where we're seeing this across the country, right? So, uh, as you can see, there's been quite a bit of activity over the last few years. And I would say this goes back to about 2021. We know there's about 25 states, give or take, that have pursued some type of legislation or executive order for indoor mapping or digital mapping for schools. Um, of those 25 states, it really varies on what these programs are. So if I look at Oklahoma, Oklahoma just has a requirement for how the data shall be presented to the school and public safety. There is no funding, there is no statewide initiative, which differs from, say, Iowa or Alabama, where you see they have passed legislation and theirs was a comprehensive statewide initiative to build an indoor map of every public school in the state and then integrate that data again into school safety and public safety applications. Uh, so the states in red have had some type of, again, legislation or executive action. The states in blue, there's some type of either pending or proposed activity. So we're watching those. And the states in gray we haven't seen any legislation. Now, that's not to say it's not happening on a school or district level, but from a legislative or governor standpoint, we have not seen any of that activity. So plenty of legislation has occurred already. A ton of funding has been allocated, but there are still some states and some big ones, if you see here, California, Arizona in particular, Ohio, where these initiatives haven't quite gotten past the finish line. So Scott, that's kind of a snapshot of kind of what a digital map is and what the current state of affairs are for the legislation. And I'll pass it over to you.
All right. Well, Dan, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And, one of the things as we kind of go through this and look at the digital mapping initiatives that are there, some of these are funded, some of them aren't. Some of them are suggestions, so on and so forth. But our school districts are working hard to make sure that they meet what some of this legislation is. And I think what we have discovered is there's kind of a challenge when that happens. So Lori, why don't you kind of tell us, as we're all working hard of putting all this technology into the school, how's this impacting the emergency response, the responders, and the 911 call centers?
Well, I would say that it can often cause a lot of confusion, and it has in the past. With I don't think that there's enough information out there for the legislators that are creating some of these laws initially. Let's put it that way, initially, and that some of those people that are developing the technology. I think that everyone needs to have a clear understanding of how that impacts the public safety response and the telecommunicators and the information that is flowing in when one of these incidents happens. It's not going to be just one call that comes in, and it's going to be a multitude of calls from one given location. Some of those might be, we were talking about, the panic buttons, or, those active alerts from the schools, but it's not just that. It's also cell phone calls. Everyone has a cell phone, and those cell phones, regardless, they might be on the other side of a campus, and they're hearing, if there's gunshots, they're hearing something happening, they're also calling. So it's just the dispatch centers can be flooded with 911 calls and alerts that it's chaos, but it needs to be coordinated chaos. And in order to do that, there has to be a lot of planning that also involves the dispatch centers as well. So I don't know if this is where we want to move on to the next slide, and we'll talk about, oh, no, that's not the one. This one right here, in building a collaborative framework to help move this along and make it a little more streamlined. Let's put it that way. So under the education, I've built out 5 different parts to this framework for success. And the first one being the education, which entails educating not only others, but also educating yourself. So we in the 911 industry, we also need to stay up on legislation and those things that are going to be impacting the dispatch centers. So we definitely need to make sure that we're staying engaged in things that are going to impact, and that means staying involved in industry associations that are watching some of this legislation and some of the technology development, and staying engaged in the process. Did you, and let me just verify, did you want me to move on here? Did you have, I noticed you had another slide before that, or do you want me to continue?
No, go ahead and continue. I went 2 slides too early.
Oh, okay. So some of the people that we may want to consider educating would be the legislators, some of the agency leadership. Even in some agency, like in larger agencies, they might not, some of the leadership may not be as granular into the details and understand the, every detail of the operations of a communication center. So it's important to make sure that the agency leadership that's also speaking on behalf of operations for a 911 center are educated as well, your technology vendors, and sometimes even the public, because the public perception and assumptions often drive some of these initiatives. So it's a continuous educational process. And then we want to build a collaborative advisory team. And depending on the initiative, you want to make sure that you're engaging the right stakeholders. So they might be from your frontline telecommunicators. If it's impacting the 911 center, those frontline telecommunicators are going to be able to tell you how this is going to impact their day-to-day operations, and if it's going to work or it's not going to work. Your 911 center leadership, the state 911 office, your industry associations, which in 911, some of the industry associations are APCO and NINA. But even individual states have individual chapters of those associations, but they also have additional ones like the 911 Coordinators Association. And they often have a great deal of knowledge that they can share about the operations in their own state. Then the IT personnel and industry vendors. And some of your industry vendors are also engaged in standards developments. So they would also need to be at the table. So again, looking at including, what the project is or what the initiative is, and making sure that you are engaging all stakeholders. And then, of course, you want to engage early, and I'll just kind of give this as an example that in Florida, when all of this came about originally, it was kind of a surprise that, to a lot of the 911 coordinators, they said, they were going to have to certify that all of these things were taking place, but the 911 coordinators had not been engaged early on in the process. So it was a learning curve for 911 coordinators in the state of Florida. And so there was lots and lots of discussion had around what all the requirements were. So I would say that at any time, make sure that you engage all of these stakeholders early on in the process. And then, of course, communicate regularly, have regular meetings, keep the conversation going, and collect and document information throughout the meetings, and conduct surveys. I am one person speaking, but there are everyone has a different opinion or different operations. And Scott, earlier on, you said that once you saw one school, you saw, one school. Well, that's the same saying it is in the 911 industry, that if you've seen one dispatch center, you've seen one dispatch center. Every one of them operates differently, has different policies, has different technology, different vendors. So it's important to make sure that you take surveys and get a consensus. And then, under the evaluate and adjust, you may consider doing beta testing or bring in centers that, have no problem being early adopters. There are some that don't want to be early adopters, but some of them are more than willing to kind of, get engaged and see how things are going to operate. So certainly find those agencies that are willing to do that.
All right. Well, Lori, thank you for giving us that information. And to be honest, as we kind of go through all of this, it's a little bit overwhelming for me, and I kind of understand the stuff, of just here's all this different legislation that's coming together for us to be able to have to provide this, or we need to consider it, or it's got to be in our plan. And all the different people that we have to coordinate with, I mean, who would have thought that we were going to be using 911 centers? Who would have thought we were going to use 911 centers with something that we're going to have to engage with regularly in school safety? And so a lot of what we've seen is why a lot of times these hiccups happen when this goes through is because the process starts with, we're told we need to put in some sort of technology. We have to be able to have this alarm that's going to be able to go off and alert first responders. And so we find the technology, we put the technology in, and then we figure out how it works. And I think, Lori, you've spoken about that on many occasions, that what you've seen from your experience is you're brought in when everything's done and said, here we are, here's your training on it, here's how we're supposed to move forward. And what we're finding is there are many disconnects, just not in the process, but also in the technology. Does it actually integrate? What do we do in those situations where, as you mentioned, Lori, 911 call centers are different. They have different technologies. What happens with a county 911 center where three of the school districts use three different types of technology, and it's all going to come into the same place. So one of the things that we've looked at is really recognizing that when we're looking at this as an outlook, the panic alarms, the digital alarms, it's more than just a button or a technology and a process we have to put in place. It's really important for us to follow a strategic plan on how we're going to move this forward. And so some of the things that this group has seen in their experience and have seen it in other districts is how we assemble that team. So, Lori, I'm going to have you talk a little bit about how you've seen some of the ways of assembling the right team and how well that's gone. And then, Sylvia, if you can spend just a couple of minutes, and Dan as well, of what have you seen as far as developing the process and ways that really helped that go smoothly.
Okay, so as far as assembling the team, a way to do that is reaching out to your state agencies. And for example, in the state of Florida, the state 911 coordinator has access to all the 911 coordinators in the state of Florida, and they can reach out and have done so on other initiatives and brought them into some of the discussions. And again, it's about looking at what the initiative is and analyzing who it's going to impact and bringing those people to the table. One thing I did want to mention too is that not just about bringing the right people in can help with some of the defining things and like the definition on a previous slide, it mentioned about bringing in or integrating with the PSAP and 911 infrastructure. Well, what does that mean? Everyone has a different interpretation. So again, bringing those people right into the to the table can help define some of those things, whether it's on, that something that has a standard definition or something that, bring in the information on how people interpret some of these definitions, because it will be and is interpreted differently. But yeah, like I said, you can reach out to state agencies such as the State 911 Coordinator, NASNA, which is the National Association of State 911 Administrators. They can also help with getting some of the right people together.
Excellent. Thank you, Lori. Dan, Sylvia, what do you guys have to add as far as looking at our team and developing that process?
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts, and I was jotting a few things down as Lori and Dan were talking. So one thing well, there's a couple of things here. So first of all, this legislation, when you see it pop up, is typically in the school safety office. If the school safety office is in the Department of Education, then there's already a handicap there for those folks because they're working directly with the schools and may not necessarily be working with state DPS, state 911 organizations. So you're already a little bit behind the eight ball. And then on the flip side of it is, as a school district, your first encounter with this technology in states that may not have passed Alyssa's law, because there's a lot of panic alert technology and a lot of suppliers and providers out there for it. But as a school district, your first encounter may be from a vendor reaching out to you, and educating you that this is even a thing that can occur. So where I saw a lot of success in Florida, in not just implementation of Alyssa's law, because we were learning a lot as we were building this program, But one of the things, just overall school safety, is those school security directors that had regular, ongoing, and established relationships with with 911, with their sheriff's office, with EMS. So with all of the response community out there, those relationships already existed. So when something like this comes up, they can reach out to these folks and say, what do you think? What do you need? Talk to a number of school districts that were already implementing panic alert technology in their schools prior to Alyssa's law passing in Florida. And they had already gone through a lot of those conversations at a local level. So I would say before even getting into any of this, bottom line, kind of one of the basic things is you really need to be having those relationships regardless of what the legislation says. If your school security director or your, sheriff's office, all of you guys need to be talking together.
My thoughts exactly. And the one item I'll just kind of put forth is it's okay to start small, right? I don't think you have to set a meeting for a half a day with all of those stakeholders if those relationships don't exist currently. Maybe it's just one person or two people that you have a conversation with, and you build that relationship and you grow from there. Uh, Rome wasn't built in a day. These projects can be cumbersome, they can be large. So start small, which is a few conversations, build that relationship. But strong agree with what Lori and Sylvia have shared.
And I think that's kind of important. One of the things that I've heard from the schools that was a bit of a struggle that really helped was stepping back and just like you said, take a little bit of time on what this actually means. Defining an alarm becomes a little bit more difficult when you step back and say, okay, we're implementing this technology. When do you press that button? Is it for this? Is it for that? Is it for this? Um, you know, Again, as the old fire guy, it's pretty easy. You pull the red thing at the door and it does one purpose. But this is a little bit different. And so I think sometimes we try to rush that process and making sure that we kind of take that time as well as put those right stakeholders together helps us really, really fit. And so as we're looking at that, that is what we've kind of seen. And, you know, what I've seen in the industry, and I'd like to have your input as well, is now that we've kind of got that process, procuring that technology really means having those vendors, having those integrators, manufacturers be able to fit your model rather than you having to fit theirs. So, what are some thoughts that you guys might have on that? Dan, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, there's a few things kind of running through my mind a bit. I think it's really critical to think about what public safety and school safety industries have already determined as far as standards and best practices. So a lot of what PASS is doing, I think, has already laid out kind of what those steps look like. So I would almost start there. And if there is a vendor or an integrator coming to you, some of the first questions that you should ask or some of the requirements that you should lay out before any engagement should be, okay, what are the standards that you're building towards or developing with? Are you adhering to industry best practices from, said organization? I think that's the starting point. And it does take two, sometimes three, four people to tango a bit when some of these applications and platforms are coming together. So I think there has to be some flexibility on all sides, but starting with a standards-based or best practices-based approach, I think is a recipe for success.
Excellent. And then kind of getting into this, and Lori, I'm going to have you kind of take us down this road a little bit, kind of talk about the importance of training and like how we would do that training. What are we looking for to make sure that when we're doing our drills, our tabletop exercises, how are we making sure that all these stakeholders come together and we make sure that the plan that we put together, the technology we put together actually does work the way we want it to?
Right. So in the training aspect of it, anyone that is going to have a part in touching that system in any way should participate in training, in regular training, whether it be, quarterly, every 6 months, annually. Everyone should participate in the process. We want to make sure that everyone that it works, like you said, as expected. But then you've also got the testing aspect of it. In testing, not only do you want to make sure that the system itself, the alert system, but you want to make sure that however it's coming into the center, that all of these different components work, because it might touch a mapping system, it might touch the telephone system, it might touch, an email system. However those notifications are coming in, we need to make sure that each part of it is working, because one piece of it may not at any given point. So it's important to test, but also keep in mind that when you're doing this testing, how many schools are there, how many tests are going to be done, and when this actually happens and how it impacts overall operations. Because what a lot of people think is that, hey, we're just going to focus on these drills or on testing, but fail to remember that the operations in a 911 center doesn't stop. It continues on all the time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. That 911 center is active. So if you're continuously doing, testing for 30 to 50 schools across the school district, what impact does that have, and how can a 911 center also document and make sure that all of these parts are working for each one of these schools? So I think that it's important that you, again, bring them into the process to make sure that, any testing or any training also helps them and meets their, what they can actually do at that given time.
And Sylvia, what do you have any thoughts on like the training side of it and testing that you kind of found in your experience as well?
Yeah, so echo a lot of what Lori just said. Another thing that comes to mind on the testing and the training is making sure that everybody understands what, number one, how to initiate the alert and what it looks like, right? So if you have a system that is only set up, I don't want to say merely, only set up for that worst case scenario, then you may inadvertently introduce a situation where the first time you use it is during that campus-wide emergency situation. So you need to figure out how to build into muscle memory a recognition of what the system looks like so you know how to react to it. And so the part of that is building that into your drills, but also how to use it and not misuse it, which that's a whole nother conversation. But I think it's making sure that there is some way that you have everybody, as Lori said, that touches that system is familiar with what it does and what it looks like and how to react to it.
Outstanding. And Dan, I'm going to ask if anyone on the webinar has any questions. We have a Q&A box, so we're going to leave a few minutes for questions. So if you want to go ahead and start putting those in or putting those in the chat, that would be good. And Dan, as we kind of look at this technology, especially the digital mapping and how all of this interfacing happens, can you kind of speak a little bit to just not only that testing side of it, but some of the maintenance things that we should consider? You're talking to the old fire alarm guy. We test it once a year because it's not supposed to break, and we typically don't use it, so we want to make sure it works. But we're in a different realm now.
Yes, we are. I think the value and what's actually it's an opportunity with this data is that it can be used for a variety of activities during the school day, right? So it's obviously, I think the focus here is, safety and security, ensuring that, staff and students are protected during the day. But this data can be used for facilities management, visitor management, events after the school day. So whether it be athletic opportunities or community events, the mapping component in particular, again, has that opportunity where you're using it on a regular basis. And so it's really important that the relationship, and we've talked about relationships already, but the relationship with that data and with the vendor that you're utilizing is strong and that there's good communication happening. Because if there are changes to that building, those need to be reflected as soon as possible, quite frankly. And I think about experiences in my daughter's school where last year they only had 2 classes. They were a little too full. And so in October, they built a third or kind of opened up a third classroom. Uh, Now, what many of these installers do, and Scott, thinking about the fire alarm, you visited, you got everything ready before the school year, and you kind of wash your hands, and it's going to work throughout the school year. Well, those buildings are pretty dynamic. And so it was really critical that that third first grade classroom was integrated onto the map. So if there was an event, they knew that it was no longer just a storage room, but it was classroom 103. And so it's that ongoing use, being able to make changes and that relationship with the data and the vendor that I think is really critical. And it's, again, I want to say it's an opportunity to have better situational awareness at your school.
Excellent. And I think one of the things that we found that works really well, from some feedback that I've gotten from districts, is having whoever's helping you do the implementation kind of have a customer advocate, a school advocate that's really responsible for making sure that this all does come together. Who is that person that is reaching out to the 911 call centers? Who's the person that is responsible for making sure that from the beginning stage to the end stage, that it all does work correctly and that all the appropriate stakeholders have been informed and that we have made sure that we've put these things in place, because there's a variety of different ways that we can do it. It's just making sure that those things happen. And especially towards the end of implementations, this is probably the most important step. And a lot of times that gets lost. So, having that in your RFP, or when you're looking at technology, of saying, how do you give us that process? How do you do that training process? How do you help us with maintenance? Not necessarily the SMA agreement, but making sure that the system works correctly. So those are some things that are definitely some takeaways that I found has helped a lot of districts as they go through putting this together. As we kind of come towards the end of this, just want to let everybody know that this webinar is being recorded and we will have it on our channel for you to be able to review, but also encourage you to look at the past guidelines. We are going to be doing a white paper for this that should come out in a couple of weeks, that kind of details what we talked about today and some of those best practices that we've seen, or leading practices that we've seen through the school districts and across the country. And really what we're looking for at the end of the day, whenever we're making a technology decision or implementation, is, what should we consider? What can we do? And how do we prioritize that? And making sure that we're taking that strategic approach. We have checklists and guidelines and white papers that are on the website. All of those are free. So, all of this is just to help educators be better, have better information to be able to make those informed decisions. And so that's why we do these webinars and we do the white papers and such that PASS does. So we're going to kind of wrap it up here. Is there anyone that has any questions? Go ahead and type them in the chat or in the Q&A. So I do have one here. So let's get started with that. Is what can be done in areas where the PSAP doesn't want your map? That's a great question.
Well, I have a question related to that. So when you say that they don't want your map, do they not want a particular map? Do they not want a map of the school? Which map are we talking about? Or is it a specific technology, or a specific vendor that they don't want to use in lieu of another one?
Sounds just like any. They don't want any maps.
Yep, any maps.
I mean, in my opinion, you really need to educate them on the benefits of having it and what can happen if they don't have it. I mean, for anyone that's been on the, call answering side of it, I mean, to be able to have that situational awareness in my mind is extremely important and helpful. It helps to guide the responders to a specific location and allow them to have a little bit more visibility into what's going on instead of having to just visualize it in your own mind. Having that being able to see it on a map is incredibly important. So I see somebody else's question.
Yeah. So we've got another one that, as this becomes law, are you aware of any new grants becoming available to fund the implementation?
So I'm going to answer that question with a question. So there's a couple of different things. So Alyssa's law and digital mapping tend to have two different funding streams. With digital mapping, what I have seen, and Dan, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this. On digital mapping, what I've seen is there's usually a one-time grant allocation. I haven't seen a whole lot of recurring funding. If there is recurring funding, it's typically going to be out of maybe a statewide general school safety allocation. There's also the federal grants that you can apply for as well. I understand those are very competitive. On Alyssa's law, that also varies across the board. If it's a requirement, because we don't like to have unfunded requirements, if there's a requirement, there's typically some sort of either one time or maybe a small recurring with a matching for the districts. Again, Alyssa's law is another one of those things with panic alert solutions that there is some there's federal opportunity as well. And if your state has passed a permissive Alyssa's law, that typically will allow you to tap into those school safety funding. Again, I know that that's typically pretty competitive and doesn't stretch very far, but those are the opportunities that I've seen.
Agreed. It really varies depending on the state, in that the alerting and the indoor mapping or the digital mapping are typically federal or separate funding streams. The school violence prevention program through the Department of Justice, the federal grant opportunity is open until August 11th. But as Sylvia, you shared, it is very competitive. So it's hard to rely on that. I will say when states have mandated these technologies, they typically provide grant funding in some way, shape, or form. So I would say your school safety center or any type of state entity should have that information. But yeah, most states that have required it, there is usually a allocation for grant funding. Does it always cover it? I can't guarantee that, but that's typically the intent.
All right, Dan, thank you. We've got one last question, and I'm going to kind of answer this one real quick because we're wrapping up and getting right to the top of the hour. But it's when law enforcement does not want to come on board, is the backup to use central call station or statewide or similar? So I think there's two parts to that question really quick. One of them is law enforcement's going to be on board whether you use the central station or not because they have to answer those calls that are going to be provided. So I think a large part of that comes down to what is the best way to go about it. There are some, and this is where you do need to look at your legislation because some legislation does not allow central stations. So the same places that do fire alarm, there's some of that Alyssa's law or digital mapping legislation that says you cannot use those. So it is really good to make sure that you take a look at what those type of things are. And that may be something that is available to you, but there is some homework to be done a little bit on whether or not that's a possibility. The technology is capable of being able to do it, but whether or not we can actually put that into process in that area is where that question really comes in. All right. I believe we have gotten through all of the questions. And with that, we are coming right at the top of the hour. So I want to thank everyone once again. Lori, Sylvia, Dan, thank you so much for putting your time together to join us today and to help us provide some of this information. And thank you all for who have joined us on the webinar. And we hope that this has been beneficial for you. Thanks for joining and stay safe.